need to admit something about my job. For 11 years, I've designed rewilding programs built on fences, careful reintroduction schedules, and constant human monitoring, trained to believe that bringing wildlife back into a damaged landscape always requires active, hands-on management. I work in conservation biology in Colorado, mostly on projects reintroducing large mammals into terrain where they've been absent for decades, and my entire professional training runs in one direction. Recovery is something you engineer, carefully, with fenced enclosures, tracking collars, veterinary intervention, and a detailed multi-year plan for exactly how much human help a struggling population needs at each stage. I've built a career on believing that the more attention and infrastructure you put into a recovery project, the more likely it is to succeed, and I've written grant proposals defending that exact premise more times than I can easily count. Then my colleague Oksana called me about a forest nobody manages at all. Oksana Melnik is a wildlife ecologist who splits her research time between Ukraine's Carpathian National Park and the long-term monitoring program inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. And we met years ago at an international rewilding conference where she presented data. I remember finding statistically interesting without fully absorbing what it actually implied about my own field's assumptions, the kind of presentation you nod along to politely without letting it actually change anything about how you do your own work afterward. She called on a weeknight, her voice carrying more energy than her usual careful, data-driven tone, and asked if I could come see, in person, what she'd been documenting for years inside the exclusion zone: wolves, brown bears absent from the region for over a century, and reintroduced Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species on Earth, all thriving inside one of the most infamous landscapes on the planet. I asked her, honestly, how a radioactive exclusion zone could possibly be teaching conservation biologists anything useful about recovery, a question I meant sincerely rather than dismissively, though I suspect it landed on her end of the call as at least a little of both. She told me, in the tone of someone who has explained this many times before to skeptical colleagues, that nobody had managed this recovery at all, and that the story only got more convincing the closer you actually looked at it. Humans had simply left, almost 40 years ago, and never come back in any meaningful numbers, and the recovery that followed had outperformed almost every actively managed rewilding project she'd ever studied. I told her that sounded like the kind of claim that needed real data behind it, not just a compelling story. She said that was exactly why she wanted me there in person rather than reading her papers from 6,000 miles away, and that she'd learned, over the years, that skepticism like mine usually meant someone was actually worth flying out to convince properly. I booked a flight 2 weeks later. I told my institution I was attending an international ecological research exchange, which was technically true, and left out how skeptical I still was that an accident could have produced better conservation outcomes than a decade of careful, deliberate professional planning. On the long flight east, I found myself pulling up my own recent grant proposals, rereading sections where I'd argued, with total confidence, that a specific reintroduction project needed additional fencing and monitoring infrastructure to succeed, and wondering, for the first time in years, whether that confidence had ever actually been tested against a genuine alternative rather than simply assumed correct because it was the approach everyone around me had always used. I had spent 11 years assuming that recovery required intervention, that a landscape left entirely alone was a landscape left to fail. I did not yet understand how completely that assumption was about to be challenged, and looking back now, I don't think I fully appreciated at the time just how thoroughly it was going to be. Ukraine meets you first through scale most people don't expect from a European country. The Dnipro River carves its way for more than 1,000 miles through the heart of the country, and beneath much of the surrounding land lies Chornozem, black earth, widely considered among the richest, most fertile soil on the planet, supporting an agricultural landscape so productive that the region has fed far beyond its own borders for generations. Oksana picked me up outside Kiev and drove us west, the flat, cultivated plains, gradually giving way to rolling hills, and then, over the course of several hours, to the forested slopes of the Carpathian Mountains, a great arc of high ground sweeping in from Central Europe and dissolving, at its eastern edge, into mist and shadow. She narrated the changing landscape as we drove, pointing out where farmland gave way to pasture and where pasture gave way, almost abruptly, to genuine forest, the transition feeling less gradual in person than it had looked on the map I'd studied on the plane. We spent my first 2 days in the Carpathians, inside stretches of old-growth beech and spruce forest protected in part through UNESCO designation. And Oksana pointed out, protected just as much by the sheer difficulty of reaching them at all, the drive itself narrowing from paved road to gravel track to something closer to a footpath long before we ever actually got out of the vehicle. Some of the beech trees here have stood for more than 300 years, their root systems draped in thick moss that muffled our footsteps almost completely as we walked. The canopy dense enough overhead that midday light reached the forest floor only in scattered, shifting patches that moved slowly across the leaf litter as the morning wore on. European bison moved through this terrain. A genuine Ice Age survivor pulled back from the brink of extinction across the 20th century, along with one of the largest remaining wild brown bear populations left in Europe, the two species occasionally sharing the same stretch of forest without much apparent friction between them. Oksana told me most people who spend their entire lives in these mountains never see a bear directly. Despite the population being genuinely substantial, the animals simply skilled enough at avoiding humans. That coexistence here looks less like conflict and more like two populations quietly agreeing not to interact. Higher in the same range, the Eurasian lynx moves almost entirely undetected, known to researchers mostly through the tracks it leaves in winter snow rather than through direct sightings. A phantom predator whose exact population size remains genuinely difficult to estimate even with modern camera trap technology. Oksana's own team still finding new individuals in their data every season they hadn't previously confirmed existed in that specific stretch of forest. Each new confirmed cat treated, she told me, almost like a small personal victory by whoever happened to spot it first in the footage. I was wrong about something. Standing in that forest my first full day, I'd assumed, walking in, that a landscape this wild would necessarily show visible signs of active management, marked trails, monitoring stations, some obvious human infrastructure holding the whole system together. Instead, Oksana pointed out a small, easily missed creature in the wet leaf litter after a rain shower, a Carpathian blue slug, luminous and faintly electric-looking, found almost nowhere else on the planet, thriving in exactly the kind of undisturbed, moisture-heavy microhabitat that only persists where almost nothing has changed in a very long time. She crouched down beside it for a long moment, clearly delighted in a way that made me realize how many hours she'd probably spent looking for exactly this kind of small, overlooked proof that a system was working the way it was supposed to. The forest wasn't being managed into wildness. It had simply been left largely alone long enough for wildness to reassert itself on its own terms. That evening, over dinner in a small mountain town, Oksana finally told me the story I'd actually flown across an ocean to understand, the one about the exclusion zone. In 1986, following the disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, an area spanning roughly 1,000 square miles was evacuated and has remained, in the decades since, almost entirely off-limits to permanent human habitation. For a long time, the assumption inside and outside the scientific community was straightforward. A landscape this contaminated would remain ecologically damaged, possibly for centuries. Radiation suppressing wildlife populations in ways that would take generations to reverse, if they ever did. What actually happened, Oksana told me, contradicted that assumption almost immediately once researchers began seriously studying the zone in the years and decades that followed. Without permanent human settlement, agriculture, hunting, or development pressure, wildlife populations didn't just persist. They expanded, dramatically, faster than almost any actively managed rewilding project on the continent, in a way that took even the scientists studying it years to fully believe. Wolves now move through the zone in numbers that researchers describe as among the highest population densities recorded anywhere in Europe, hunting freely across abandoned agricultural land that has spent decades reverting to forest and meadow, camera traps regularly, capturing images of packs moving through what used to be residential courtyards. Brown bears, absent from this specific region for more than a century before the evacuation, have been documented moving back into the zone in recent years, drawn by exactly the kind of undisturbed habitat that has become genuinely rare elsewhere on the continent. Their return treated by researchers less as a surprise and more as confirmation of exactly the pattern the rest of the zone's recovery had already suggested. Moose wade through the flooded cooling channels near the old plant itself, and birch and maple have pushed up through cracked asphalt across what used to be wide Soviet-era boulevards in the abandoned city of Pripyat, turning entire neighborhoods into dense, young forest within a few decades of the evacuation, rooftops barely visible above the canopy in some sections. Most remarkably, in the late 1990s, researchers introduced a small population of Przewalski's horses into the zone as something close to a desperate experiment, the species representing the only truly wild horse lineage left on Earth, never domesticated at any point in its evolutionary history. The horses didn't just survive inside one of the most infamous landscapes on the planet. They thrived, their population growing steadily across the decades since, grazing freely through meadows that radiation warnings had once suggested might remain unusable for generations, foals born and raised entirely within the zone, having known no other environment at all. I was wrong about something specific. Sitting at that dinner table, I'd assumed, walking into this trip, that Chernobyl's ecological story would be one of contamination held narrowly at bay by tough, resilient species, managing to survive despite ongoing damage. What Oksana was actually describing was closer to the opposite, a landscape where the removal of continuous human activity, more than any single environmental factor, had allowed populations to recover and expand at a rate that outpaced almost every deliberately engineered conservation program either of us had ever studied. My entire field treats human absence as an obstacle to manage around, a gap in the data, a logistical problem for monitoring. Chernobyl had demonstrated, over nearly 4 decades, that human absence itself could function as the single most powerful conservation tool available, more effective than almost anything my own profession had spent decades trying to deliberately engineer. Oksana said it more plainly than I would have, over the second round of coffee that evening. Sometimes the kindest thing a species can be given isn't a program. It's simply being left alone long enough to remember how to do the rest itself. The day everything actually came into sharp, immediate focus happened 4 days into my visit, when Oksana brought me along on a field survey inside the Carpathian Park, tracking a small group of European bison that her research team had been monitoring for several seasons, using a strict, deliberately minimal intervention protocol. Observation only, no feeding, no handling, no medical intervention beyond documenting what happened naturally. We set out before dawn, the forest still cold and faintly blue in the early light, mist clinging low to the ground between the trees, moving slowly and quietly enough that I felt, within the first half hour, like I was the least skilled member of the group by a wide margin, snapping twigs underfoot that everyone else somehow managed to avoid entirely. The field researcher leading that day's survey was a man named Taras Lysenko, who has worked in wildlife monitoring across the Carpathians for close to 15 years. Someone whose quiet, careful movement through the forest made it clear he'd spent most of his career learning to be as unobtrusive as the animals he studied, reading broken branches and disturbed leaf litter the way I might read a sentence, occasionally crouching to examine a track the rest of us had walked straight past without noticing at all. We'd been tracking the bison group's general movement pattern for a couple of hours, keeping a respectful distance, when Taras stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing, having spotted something the rest of us hadn't yet noticed, his whole posture changing in a way that told me, before he said anything, that something was wrong. A bison calf, young enough to still be nursing, lay alone in the underbrush at the clearing's edge. No adult bison visible anywhere nearby. The calf's breathing visibly labored even from a distance, its legs occasionally twitching in a way that made it hard to look away from. Taras told us, keeping his voice low, that separation, this complete at this age, was genuinely dangerous without an adult. The calf had little realistic chance of surviving more than another day or two on its own, vulnerable to predation, exposure, and its own inability to nurse. And every minute we stood there watching felt, to me, considerably longer than it probably actually was. He had a decision in front of him with no comfortable version. The park's monitoring protocol, one he had personally helped develop over years of research, specifically because minimal intervention had produced measurably healthier, more naturally resilient wildlife populations across the reserve, argued strongly against any direct human intervention, treating natural mortality, even among young, vulnerable animals, as an essential part of a functioning wild system rather than a problem requiring correction. Intervening now, approaching the calf, attempting to locate and reunite it with its mother, or in the worst case, removing it for hand-rearing, would directly violate that carefully reasoned principle and could, if handled imperfectly, cause the mother to reject the calf entirely, even if reunification were attempted, potentially causing more harm than simply allowing nature to take its course. Walking away and documenting the outcome as data, the response the protocol technically called for, meant accepting the near certainty that we would be watching, at close range, an animal die that a small amount of intervention might have saved. Oksana told me later that she'd watched Taras make a version of this exact calculation dozens of times over the years, and that it never once looked easy, no matter how many times the data ultimately vindicated the decision to hold back. I watched Taras work through it in something close to real time, scanning the tree line repeatedly for any sign of the herd, checking the wind direction to judge whether the mother might still be within scent range, weighing years of accumulated evidence about non-intervention's broader ecological benefits against the specific, immediate reality of one visibly struggling animal in front of him. There was no protocol flowchart that resolved this particular moment cleanly. He made the call, after several tense minutes that felt considerably longer standing inside them, to hold position and observe rather than intervene, choosing to trust the broader pattern his own research had documented over years rather than the acute, understandable pull to act on behalf of the single animal directly in front of him. The bison's mother returned to the clearing roughly 40 minutes later, drawn back, Taras guessed, by the calf's distress calls once the rest of the herd had settled a safe distance away. The reunion happened without any human involvement at all, the calf nursing again within minutes, the pair rejoining the herd before dusk, disappearing back into the tree line as though the previous 40 minutes had never happened. Taras told me afterward, once we'd made our way back down the trail in near silence, that the outcome didn't retroactively make the decision feel easy in the moment, and that he'd made a version of this same call before that hadn't ended, as fortunately, a separated calf from 2 seasons earlier that the team had ultimately documented as a natural mortality rather than intervening to prevent. A case he mentioned quietly, almost in passing, without offering any further detail I felt comfortable asking for. I was wrong about something specific, watching that decision unfold. I'd assumed, walking into that clearing, that a well-designed conservation protocol would make a moment like this feel more resolved, more clearly correct, once the right procedure had actually been followed. What I actually watched was someone holding an enormous amount of professional discipline against an equally enormous, entirely understandable emotional pull to act, understanding that the discipline itself, sustained consistently across many individual moments like this one, was the actual mechanism producing the healthier population. Oksana had shown me data on the night before. The hardest part of minimal intervention, it turned out, wasn't designing the policy. It was standing inside a single, specific instance of it and choosing, deliberately, to do less than every instinct in your body was telling you to do, with no guarantee at all, in that exact moment, of how the story was actually going to end. Once that afternoon had passed, Oksana had several more days planned before my flight home, and she used them, deliberately, to show me how far this same underlying principle recovery driven by absence and restraint rather than constant intervention extended across the rest of the country's landscapes. We drove north into the exclusion zone itself on my 6th day, Oksana walking me through the practical realities of researching inside it. Dosimeters checked constantly, specific routes followed to avoid the most contaminated pockets. Visits kept deliberately short in certain areas even decades after the initial disaster. Standing at the edge of Pripyat, the abandoned city's rusted amusement park, visible through a screen of young trees that had grown up around it entirely unplanted, the silence was genuinely unlike anything else I'd experienced that week, broken occasionally by birdsong and once by the distant, unmistakable howl of a wolf somewhere beyond the tree line, a sound that raised the hair on my arms, even though I understood, intellectually, that it belonged there far more than I did. I stood in the middle of what had once been a wide central boulevard, apartment blocks visible through gaps in a canopy that had grown thick enough, in places, to fully obscure the buildings behind it, and tried, without much success, to picture the same street full of ordinary Soviet-era foot traffic 4 decades earlier. We spent an afternoon with a smaller research team monitoring the zone's Przewalski's horse population, watching a small herd graze through a meadow that had been agricultural land within living memory, the horses entirely unbothered by our presence at a respectful distance, moving with the same unhurried confidence I imagined their ancestors had moved with across the Eurasian steppe for tens of thousands of years before domestication ever touched horses at all. One of the researchers told me the population had grown steadily enough over the decades that small groups had begun dispersing further into the zone on their own, without any additional human relocation effort required, foals staying close to their mothers in the tall grass, while the rest of the herd grazed steadily toward the tree line as the light started to fade. We traveled south afterward to the Black Sea coast near Odessa, where the warmer, saltier water supports an entirely different ecological community than anything we'd seen in the mountains or the exclusion zone. Migratory birds using the coastal wetlands as a critical stopover point on journeys stretching between Arctic breeding grounds and wintering areas thousands of miles to the south. Oksana pointed out flocks of waders working the tidal mudflats at dusk, refueling on invertebrates before continuing a journey most of them would complete largely at night, navigating by a combination of magnetic sensing and star patterns that researchers still don't fully understand even after decades of study, the birds rising in a single, coordinated wave when something startled them from the far end of the flats and resettling just as quickly a few hundred meters away. She told me the coastal wetlands here function as one link in a chain of similar stopover sites, stretching the length of the flyway, each one individually modest in size but collectively essential, the loss of any single link in the chain capable of threatening species that depend on the whole route staying intact. Inland from the coast, we visited the edge of the Podillia region, home to one of the longest gypsum cave systems anywhere on Earth, a twisting, crystal-lined maze stretching for hundreds of kilometers underground. Much of it still being actively mapped by cave researchers decades into the project, a small team of specialists dedicating entire careers to a single, still incomplete map. We only went a short distance in, headlamps catching pale mineral formations that had been growing, in some cases, for tens of thousands of years, the air noticeably cool and still, compared to the surface, an entirely different kind of slow, undisturbed process happening in complete darkness beneath the same landscape whose surface I'd spent the week getting to know in daylight. Oksana told me researchers still occasionally map entirely new passages even now, the system large enough that a complete survey remains, realistically, a project for another generation of cavers rather than this one, each new mapped section adding to a total length that has grown steadily, almost every year, since serious exploration began. On my last full day, Oksana took me back toward the Dnipro River itself, near the old rapids at Khortytsia, where the landscape opens into wide steppe grassland, chest-high wild grasses rolling in the wind toward a flat, unbroken horizon that made the mountains from earlier in the week feel like they belonged to an entirely different country. Ground squirrels and steppe marmots moved between burrows across the open ground, disappearing underground the moment we got within a certain distance, and birds of prey circled steadily overhead, taking advantage of thermals rising off sun-warmed grassland that has supported a genuinely resilient, specialized grassland ecosystem for a very long time, adapted to fire, grazing, and drought in ways that require almost none of the careful, ongoing management. My own field typically assumes wild grassland needs to persist. Oksana and I sat for a while at the edge of the rapids, watching the light shift across the grass as evening came on, neither of us saying much, which felt, by that point in the week, like the correct way to end a trip that had spent so much of its time quietly arguing against the value of constant intervention. I flew home 2 days later. Oksana stayed. Obviously her research is there, in a way that made far more sense to me having spent a week standing inside its actual subject matter than it ever had, reading her papers from a conference hallway in Colorado, papers I now plan to reread with considerably more attention than I'd originally given them. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, usually circling back, in one form or another, to some version of the same unresolved question neither of us has fully answered. How much of what my own field treats as necessary intervention is actually just a habit built around wanting to feel useful, rather than a genuinely evidence-based judgment about what a specific landscape actually needs? She emailed me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in Colorado with an update from Taras, the message arriving on an unremarkable Wednesday morning while I was in the middle of an entirely unrelated site visit report. The bison population his team monitors had had a genuinely strong season. Several new calves documented, including one, born a few weeks after my visit, that Taras had specifically noted in his log as a reminder of the clearing where we'd all stood watching and waiting together, a small, private detail he apparently hadn't mentioned to anyone else on the team. He'd apparently mentioned to Oksana that he still thought about that afternoon fairly often, not because the outcome had been bad, but because he'd come to understand that the discipline required to do nothing on purpose, correctly, under real emotional pressure, never actually got easier, no matter how many times the data proved the approach was working. Oksana also mentioned, almost as a postscript, that the park had started using that specific incident, described in careful, anonymized detail, as part of the training material for newer field researchers joining the monitoring program, less as a model answer to memorize and more as an honest illustration of what the job actually asks of the person standing in that clearing, faced with a decision no training manual could ever fully prepare them to feel calm about. I don't think the lesson I took from that trip is really about bison, or wolves, or radioactive forests. Not only, it's about how easily my own field had equated intervention with care, treating a hands-off approach as a kind of negligence rather than recognizing it, in the right circumstances, as the more rigorous, more evidence-based choice. Chernobyl didn't recover because anyone managed it brilliantly. It recovered because, for nearly 4 decades, almost nobody was there to manage it at all, and an entire ecosystem quietly demonstrated what it was capable of doing on its own, given that specific, uninterrupted kind of room. I've started, since coming home, proposing at least one genuinely minimal intervention option alongside every rewilding plan I draft now, a change that has been received with more open curiosity from younger colleagues than from the more senior ones who trained me, several of whom still find the entire premise faintly uncomfortable to sit with, in a way I recognize because I felt exactly the same discomfort myself before this trip. What stays with me most isn't the size of the wolf population or the age of the cave formations, honestly. It's the image of Taras standing at the edge of that clearing, holding still against every instinct telling him to act, trusting years of accumulated evidence over the acute, understandable pull of one visibly struggling animal in front of him. I think about how much of what actually allows a wild system to recover depends on someone disciplined enough to recognize that the most useful thing they can do, in a specific moment, is genuinely nothing at all, and how much harder that restraint turns out to be in practice than any of the active, hands-on interventions my own career has spent a decade getting good at. I think too about every project I've designed that assumed more monitoring, more fencing, more managed care was automatically the safer, more responsible choice, and how many of those projects I'd probably design a little differently now, with a lot more respect for exactly how much a landscape can accomplish once you finally get out of its way and stop assuming it needs you standing there watching every single moment of the process. A short, quiet breath before I let you go, longer than the one I usually take at this point in a story like this. If this story changed how you think about what real conservation actually requires, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Maybe it's the wolves reclaiming Pripyat's old boulevards. Maybe it's Taras standing motionless at the edge of that clearing. I still find myself thinking about both. Usually while reviewing a rewilding proposal that suddenly looks a little more crowded with unnecessary infrastructure than it did before this trip, infrastructure I once would have defended without hesitation. Because somewhere in a forest in Ukraine right now, a wolf is moving through terrain that has spent nearly 40 years quietly learning to need almost nothing from us at all, and will likely keep doing exactly that long after this particular story stops being told. How many of the landscapes we assume require our constant attention would actually recover faster and more completely if we simply had the discipline to leave them alone, the way an entire ecosystem quietly proved it could, in a place nobody ever expected to become a conservation success story at all? This narrative is told through the perspective of Dana Ferris, a fictional conservation biologist based in Colorado, and includes the fictional composite characters Oksana Melnik and Taras Lysenko. The ecological, geographic, and scientific details of Ukraine described here, including the documented recovery of wolf, brown bear, and Przewalski's horse populations within the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the biodiversity of the Carpathian old-growth forests, the Podillia gypsum cave system, and the migratory bird populations along the Black Sea coast are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific bison calf incident and Terrace's decision, described in this script, are a fictionalized composite representing the general kind of judgment calls minimal intervention wildlife researchers are trained to make, rather than a documented real event tied to any specific date or research team.